Hello. This is going to be the first of a couple short videos I do this week. This first one is going to be on enthymemes, which is an argument with a missing premise or conclusion, or I should say an unstated premise or conclusion, something that is assumed usually. And then later in this week, we're going to be going over something called the Sorites. Sorites are multiple arguments that are plugged into one another to create one large argument. And then we're going to start pulling all of these ideas together, the categorical syllogisms, the four rules of validity, the enthymemes, and the Sorites, to start breaking down and analyzing longer natural form arguments in the later part of this week. So I apologize that I've been a little off my tempo in the release of these videos. I don't know, it took me a little while to get my head wrapped around how to roll these out, and ultimately I'm not going to do anything too fancy. I'm just going to present these one small issue at a time, and then in the larger, and then at the end of the week I'll have a larger video to kind of do a more full-scale approach. That will bring us to the end of the categorical syllogism section of the semester. Okay, so let's get into the topic. First, for reference in your book, enthymemes were discussed way back in chapter 2 on page 25 through 27. This is long before we started talking about categorical syllogisms, so the ideas presented in chapter 2 speak about enthymemes in a very general way. For our purposes, the book also talks about the enthymemes between pages 160 and 162. And these pages speak directly to how enthymemes are presented in categorical syllogisms. So you can we'll see some examples here in a few minutes here, but with categorical syllogisms, it's pretty easy to imagine. You imagine a categorical syllogism. So we're thinking of an argument with two premises, two categorical premises, and a conclusion. And just like, that's always what a categorical syllogism has in its sort of abstract or true form. But then the way it's presented or said will often be missing a single statement. So that's what a enthymeme is going to look like. So when we say that an argument has a missing premise, it might sound like a bad argument. And in some cases, that's what it's going to be. We'll often make conclusions too quickly based on nothing at all. But in some cases, it's because the missing premise is either widely known, we know that the audience members have already come to accept that premise, and so it's safe to continue to use that premise. I've probably made arguments like that in the duration of this talk, that I've simply made an argument and assumed the premise without even realizing it. This happens all the time. It doesn't mean the argument is necessarily bad. It's just sometimes we want to make sure we understand what is being left unsaid. And sometimes that's going to help us a lot in understanding where the arguer is coming from and figuring out where the common ground is. I'm going to have to pause this video real quickly to open the door for Babel here. All right, took care of the cat. Okay, so moving on with this, the literal meaning of the word enthymeme, it means to have in mind. We might think about as a premise as something that goes without saying, but you still depend upon it in order to make your logical conclusions. Okay, so one thing about enthymemes is we're going to try to exercise something called the principle of charity. I've touched on this really briefly earlier. The principle of charity, when it comes to arguments, means that we are going to try to assume the best of the argument. So one version, let's just talk about how people argue with each other. We can see this all the time in arguments. If you've learned logical fallacies, this is something that is often taught in English classes and rhetoric classes, something called the informal logical fallacies, and sometimes we talk about them in logic classes too, depending on who's teaching the class. One of the logical fallacies is called the straw man argument. The straw man argument. The way the straw man argument works is that to make your case, or to show that your opponent's case is bad, we make a bad version of that argument. We take the weakest version. So for example, if I was a Democrat, one way I might make my side seem like it's the better side is make the Republican version of the argument really bad. Like take the worst version of a Republican argument for how we're supposed to do taxes, right? And I beat that argument down. I beat the worst version of that argument down. And then I say, look, my argument is better, therefore I have won, or something like that. In other words, the straw man argument is a logical fallacy because instead of comparing the best version of one argument with the best version of another argument, you try to come up with, you try to prove that your argument is better than the worst version of the other argument. It's a logical fallacy because it doesn't really show that your side is stronger. It just shows that you've been able to give a weak version of someone else's argument. The principle of charity is almost the opposite of the straw man. Instead of trying to find the worst version of the argument, I try to find the best version of the argument that I'm trying to knock down. And if I find the best version of the argument that I'm trying to knock down and I test myself, I try to find flaws in that, if I succeed, it's actually a much stronger version of my argument. I make a better case for my own side when I argue against the best case, the best version of the other side. If that makes sense. We can talk about this in class more extensively too. So that's what we're going to try to do with enthymemes. In other words, when we see a missing premise, it would be easy to say, well, that's a bad argument because it depends upon a premise that isn't given. But the principle of charity is going to demand us to find a premise, if one exists, in such a way that it makes the argument valid. Which means we want to think about a missing premise that will cause the argument in its final form to be following all 4 rules of validity. At least that's how we're going to think about it in this context of categorical syllogisms. Okay, moving on. All right, so we're going to structure the rest of this video in the same way we've done a number of the other ones. I'm going to give a problem. I'll pause the video. You will figure it out. And then once you've come up with an answer, you can press play. In the first example, I'm just going to go right into the explanation of how to get to a solution as a kind of example. And then the rest will be the sort of problems for you to do. Let's move on. This first one here, it's pretty simple. All tyrannies oppress their citizens. Therefore, the city-state of Alexia oppresses its citizens. Okay, so when we're doing this, you remember way back to when we were thinking about premise indicators and conclusion indicators. In other words, those words that tell us whether a sentence is a premise or a conclusion. Sometimes we have to depend on context. Sometimes we think about what is the flow of the argument. Here, the really good clue is this word therefore. The therefore indicates that the rest of this is a conclusion, okay? So that means that this is a premise. All tyrannies oppress their citizens, right? So that's one premise. Now, is it premise 1 or is it premise 2? Doesn't matter. And it does matter because of the location of the minor and major terms. But for now, we're just going to write premise. And we're going to write, so we're going to say this sentence, if we were to understand its standard form, it would be all tyrannies are governments that oppress their citizens. In other words, this is an A statement that says all T are O for oppressors, okay? So we're going to write this down here. All T are O. Now we're going to leave some space both above it and below it because I don't know if this is going to be premise 1 or premise 2. But then we're going to write our conclusion. The city-state of Alexia oppresses its citizens. And we remember from earlier lessons on translations that when we translate the proper noun, so any kind of singular proper noun, such as the city-state of Alexia, we're not talking about just one city that is called Alexia. We're talking about the city that is called Alexia. We're talking about every city that is called Alexia, that is this city of Alexia. So we're going to use the A statement, the universal. All city-states of Alexia, all, let's say A, for capital A for Alexia, are governments or cities that oppress its citizens. So that's the O here. All A are O. Okay. Now we have our premise and we have our conclusion. Now we have to figure out, what is this missing premise? And is it premise 1 or is it premise 2? Well, to figure that out, we look to our conclusion. We say, all right, our A, that's our minor term. And it's the minor term because it is the subject of the conclusion. We talked about that before. And the O is our major term. It's the major term because it's the predicate of the conclusion. So which of these two letters appears in the premises? Obviously, it's O. So because this is the major term, this is the major term, and this is the major premise or premise 1. So we can now mark this as premise 1. Now we have to ask, what is premise 2 going to be in such a way that it follows all 4 rules of validity? Now, this is where a little bit of reverse engineering comes in. First of all, we have to ask, what are the terms? Now, the terms we can deduce from everything else. We know that O is the major term, and we already see that twice, right? A is the minor term, and it only appears once so far. So that means we know that A must go under premise 2. T, therefore, must be the middle term because it's the only one of the 3 terms that does not appear in the conclusion. So we're going to put T over to the side here. We know that A and T are here. Now the question is, should it go AT or TA? And should this be an A, E, I, or O statement? Now, by the process of elimination, we can already eliminate a couple of things. We can eliminate the E and the O statement as a possibility. And the reason is rule number 4. Rule number 4 says, if you have a negative premise, you must have a negative conclusion. And if you have a negative conclusion, you must have a negative premise. Now, if premise 2 was negative, if it was an E or it was an O, that would force the conclusion to be negative as well. But the conclusion is not negative. Therefore, if this argument is valid, it must be either an A statement or an I statement. Next, we want to figure out, so is this an A or is it an I? Let's look at some of the other rules now. Rule number 1 states the middle term must be distributed at least once. Now, we get, again, the T is the middle term. If it was not distributed in premise 1, then we'd have to make sure it was distributed in premise 2, right? So you can tell that kind of determines where it's going to be and what kind of sentence it's going to be. But it is distributed. It is distributed because it is in the subject of an A statement. So that means we don't have to worry about rule 1. It already fulfills the conditions of rule 1. It doesn't matter. So actually, based on rules 1 and 4 now, this could either be, premise 2 could either be an A statement or an I statement. Well, let's look at rule number 2. If a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in the premises. We notice here that our A is the subject of an A statement, which means it is distributed. That means that it must be distributed somewhere in premise 2. Now, if you recall, an I statement does not distribute either its subject or its predicate. Because we know the A statement, or because we know, not the A statement, but the A term must be distributed in premise 2, and because the I doesn't distribute either term, We know it cannot be an I statement. Therefore, we know the premise 2 must be an A statement. It must be all, and it must be all A, because that puts the minor term in the distributed slot. All A are T. In other words, it goes all, just to clean this up a little bit, all T are O, all A are T, and all A are O. Okay? That is a valid argument. So the missing premise ends up being something like all, or you should say something like the city-state of Alexia is a tyranny. And what I did there is I translated it back to the normal language in the same kind of voice that was being used in the original statement. The city-state of Alexia is a tyranny. So the whole argument reads something like all tyrannies oppress their citizens, and Alexia oppresses its citizens. Therefore, Alexia is a tyranny. Therefore, Alexia oppresses its citizens. Okay. What is the mood and figure of this? Well, no surprise, this is an AAA1 argument. In other words, it has that same structure as all mammals are animals, all dogs are mammals, therefore all dogs are animals. Same arguments, just different terms. Here is another argument. So figure out, I'm going to pause this video and figure out what is the missing statement. All right, so let's walk through this one again. Anyone who sympathizes with the Spartans is a traitor, so Dmitri is a traitor. So the so is our conclusion indicator. So we can tell already that Dmitri, this is a proper noun, this is the name of someone. Dmitri is a traitor. So all D are T. And anyone who sympathizes with the Spartans is a traitor. All sympathizers are, all Spartan sympathizers are traitors. All Spartan sympathizers are traitors. Now, make sure, before you continue any further, make sure that you have figured out the missing premise at this point. If your argument doesn't look like this, stop, figure this part out, and go back over it again. Now, once again, we see that our major term, the major term, the predicate of the conclusion, is already up here. So we know that this is premise 1. Just like before, we notice that we do not have any negative statements. Therefore, we don't have to worry about rule 3. This could be negative based on rule 3, which says we cannot have more than one negative statement, more than one negative premise. But in order for it not to break rule 4, we have to make sure that it's affirmative. So once again, this must be either A or I. As before, we know that so this is our, T is our major, D must be our minor, and that's going to be down here somewhere, and S must be our middle. Since S is already distributed once, we don't have to worry about rule number 1. Rule number 2 states that the minor term, if the minor term is distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in the premises. An I statement doesn't distribute anything, therefore we're going to need the A statement, and this ends up being exactly the same as the previous one, as an A1 argument. Now I promise you the rest of them are not going to be straight up this simple. Maybe some of them are, but not all. A1 argument really is the most common kind of argument that we will run into in the world. All right, here's another one. Some mammals live in the water, since whales live in the water. Pause the video. All right, if you're listening to this now, you should have figured out what the missing statement is. So let's break it out once again, break it down once again. The only indicator word we have here is since. This is actually a premise indicator. So as a premise indicator, we are going to take whales live in water, it's not just talking about some whales, it's talking about all whales, or all W, are creatures that live in the water. We're going to use L for live. The conclusion, since when this is a premise indicator, this also kind of, in a backward way, indicates that this is the thing that we are concluding from the whales live in the water, from the premise. We don't even know what premise this is, 1 or 2 yet. So we're going to put some mammals live in the water, some M, R, L. We're going to put that down here. Now we can already tell this is not going to be exactly the same as the previous arguments because we have an I statement in the conclusion. Now to break this down again, we still know that this is premise 1 because L here is our major term, the predicate of the conclusion. And from there, we're going to figure out premise 2. Now, because we have an affirmative premise and an affirmative conclusion, we once again know that premise 2 cannot be a conclusion. It cannot be a negative statement. And premise 2 must be either an A or an I. Now, once again, whales, our middle term is already distributed, so we don't know if this is A or I. And here, we don't have a distributed term in the conclusion. Both of these terms are undistributed, which means it doesn't matter if the premise 2 distributes a term or not. Now, in this case, this is something unusual. We actually have no good reason to choose A over I or I over A. It could be either A or I. So what's the right answer? Could be either one, actually. Both would be equally valid, correct answers in this case, assuming we are using the Aristotelian form of logic, which is what we've been using in this class so far. Just a little side note, I've kind of alluded to this before, but there is a different, more modern version of logic, categorical logic, in which it would actually force us to use the sum, the I statement, but we're not there yet. And so for our purposes, either the A or the I would be perfectly valid. So this would be, let's use the sum, M, R, W. Some mammals are whales. Some mammals are whales, which is true. If we put all mammals are whales, that would be a little weird because it's not true, but it would still be just as valid. Okay. So if you had, and because in this case, the figure, whether you had M, then W, or W, or N, that wouldn't matter either, because it wouldn't affect the distribution or the negative statements of this argument. So in all, we could have had the following. We started with an A blank I with a figure, given that the middle term is here, and that would either be for figure 1 or figure 3. So this is either A blank I, 1, or 3. And like literally every version of that is fine. In other words, I, 1, I, 3, I, 1, I, 3. All 4 of these would have been valid ways of interpreting this argument. These require that, well, it depends on how which one of this. One of these, this one, requires that all mammals are whales, which is false. This one requires all whales are mammals, which is true. So we might be inclined to pick this one or one of these as the best answer in order to get a sound argument, but any 4 of these are valid. Okay. You owe taxes only if you are a citizen, therefore you are not a citizen. This one's a little bit trickier. So why don't you pause this video, give it a think, and then press play once you are ready to begin again. Give it your best shot. Oh, I didn't even stop recording to that. So let's break this down. First of all, we have our very clear conclusion indicator word, therefore. You are not a citizen. All right, so you again is a proper noun. It's pointing directly to you. All people who are you are not citizens. So we're going to say, no, you are citizens. That's the conclusion. You owe taxes only if you are a citizen. So this one, we have this only if phrase that is very, can be a little tricky. You owe taxes only if you are a citizen. Does that mean all people who owe taxes are citizens? Or does that mean all people who are citizens owe taxes? So let's think about that construction. You owe taxes only if you are a citizen. Okay? That means that if you owe taxes, you must be a citizen. Not if you are a citizen, then you must owe taxes. So we're going to put all people who owe taxes, we're going to say T for owe taxes, are citizens. Okay. Now in this case, so we have the citizens C and C. So once again, this is our major term. That's our major term. So we know that this is premise 1. Now, let's see if we can break down, let's see if we can figure this out. For the first time today, we're looking at an argument with a negative statement. Now, remember rule number 4. If there is a negative premise, there must be a negative conclusion. And if there is a negative conclusion, there must be a negative premise. We have a negative conclusion. And the premise we've been given so far is not negative. Therefore, premise 2 must also be negative. It must either be an E or an O. Now, another thing about this, we ask, all right, what is our middle term here? Our middle term is T. That is distributed. It's in the distributed slot, which is good because that means it doesn't matter if it's distributed down here. Now, E will distribute everything, but O will only distribute one term. Here it says no Y or C. The Y is distributed. That's our minor term. So the Y must be distributed up here. So let's try. So we know then that this is going to be the case. I'm babbling today. I'm stuttering today. Sorry about that. Sometimes it happens. I guess I'm a bit of a stutterer. It's happening more as I get older. The E statement would distribute our Y term, but we don't need it to distribute 2 terms as an E could do. An O statement only distributes 1. So it does fulfill the needs of distributing the Y. In other words, we could choose either one of these. So again, because we have 2 universal statements, I'm just going to take the no statement, no, the no Y R T. In other words, no, you are people who owe taxes. You do not owe taxes. So the way this goes is all people who owe taxes are people who are citizens, but you do not owe taxes. Therefore, you are not a citizen. I don't know. You probably are. Maybe you're not. I don't know. It doesn't matter. This is just an example for the book. And so this is what one version of this argument could look like. Now, again, it wouldn't have mattered if these terms were switched. And in fact, our O version of the statement, so the O version is actually more interesting for premise 2. If we had some T are not Y, that's good. But if we said some Y are not T, that's bad because our Y was distributed in the conclusion, but not distributed in the premises, okay? So that means we could have had 3 different versions of a valid argument here. I wasn't asking for all of them, I was just seeing if you could figure out one. So one version of the valid argument is, as I've written here, A, E, E, 1. And because we could have switched these terms and it would have still been valid, A, E, E, 3 would still have been valid. You could have had premise 2 as a O statement, A, O, E, but in that case, only when the Y was in the predicate would that have worked, which means our middle term was in the subject slot of both statements, A, O, E, 3. So in this argument, our enthymeme could have been any of these 3. Well, that's where I'm going to leave it today. There are more examples in your book. I encourage you to check them out, and I will have the answers for each of those posted within a day. I hope that was helpful. Let me know if you have questions, and I will talk to you later.